You're retiring with $2 million or more. There is a single decision that can move the needle by $500,000 or more over the course of your retirement. And it's not Roth conversions, it's not Social Security timing, or some arcane investment withdrawal strategy. And even if you're one of the people who have given this serious thought, the number of individuals who actually run the full calculation before they retire is surprisingly small. Which is why in today's video, we're going to cover the one retirement move that can save you millions. So meet Joseph and Annie. Joseph spent his career working his way up through a regional HVAC company, starting on the trucks, moving into management, and eventually reaching a senior leadership role that he held for the better part of 2 decades. Annie stayed at home and raised the children and did it very well. Between Joseph's salary, disciplined saving into his 401k over 35 years, and a modest pension from his company, they've arrived at retirement in genuinely solid shape. Their financial picture looks like this: approximately $2.5 million in combined retirement assets, the bulk of it in Joseph's 401k, with a smaller IRA and a joint taxable account making up the rest. They own their home in Maryland, paid off, worth around $700,000. They have life insurance, adult children they'd like to leave something meaningful to, and a retirement spending target of $150,000 per year. Comfortable, but not extravagant. The kind of retirement that they planned for, saved for, and earned. But what they hadn't planned for, and this is where the conversation gets interesting, is the full cost of where they've chosen to retire. Not their lifestyle, not their investment choices, but their address. Because where you retire at is a tax decision. Most people treat it as a lifestyle decision, which to be fair it also is, but the financial dimension of that choice, the income tax you pay on every IRA distribution, the estate tax that your family pays on your hard-earned money when you're gone, the total burden over a 25 or 30 plus year retirement is very calculable, and for Joseph and Annie, running that calculation changed their thinking considerably. Now, before I tell you what the move is, it's worth understanding what it's actually costing them. Because until you see the number, it's easy to assume that it's someone else's problem. So let's talk a little bit about that, right? And give a bit of a Maryland tax overview. Maryland is a genuinely pleasant place to live. Good infrastructure, proximity to major cities, strong health care, a reasonable cost of living relative to its neighbors. None of that is in dispute. But from a retirement tax standpoint, it presents a picture worth examining carefully. Let's start with income tax. Maryland has a graduated state income tax ranging from 2% to 6.5% at the top bracket. Every county in the state levies an additional local income tax on top of that, up to 3.3%, depending on where you live. Combined, Maryland's state and local income tax burden in most populated counties reaches 8.95%, among the highest in the country. Now, Maryland does exempt Social Security from state income tax, which is a genuine positive and worth acknowledging. And it also offers a pension exclusion of up to $41,200 for those 65 and older on qualifying employer plan income. So Joseph's 401k distributions may have a portion sheltered. But above that exclusion, every dollar of that 401k income is taxed as ordinary income at those combined state and local rates. So for Joseph and Annie, drawing $150,000 per year in retirement between 401k distributions, investment income, and eventually Social Security, the Maryland income tax bill, after applicable exclusions, likely runs into the range of $6,000 to $9,000 per year, depending on the county and income composition. That's a vacation with family. Over 25 years, even without adjusting for inflation or investment returns on those dollars, that's $150,000 to $225,000 in state income taxes alone. Real money paid on income that they've already paid the federal tax on. So that's the income picture. But where it becomes even more interesting is the estate picture, and where Maryland becomes genuinely singular, and where the calculation for Joseph and Annie gets considerably more consequential. So let's talk about the estate problem. Maryland is the only state in the country that imposes both a state estate tax and a state inheritance tax. Understanding both the estate tax and the inheritance tax matters for Joseph and Annie because both affect what their children ultimately receive. The estate tax works like this. Maryland's exemption is $5 million per person, a threshold that's been frozen since 2019 and is not adjusted for inflation. By contrast, the federal estate tax rose to $15 million per person in 2026 after the One Big Beautiful Bill Act made the higher exemption permanent. That gap, $5 million at the state level versus $15 million federally, creates a zone that catches a lot of Maryland families by surprise. Estates that are worth between $5 and $15 million face a hefty Maryland estate tax with zero federal counterpart. And the top Maryland estate tax rate is 16%. Not fun. Joseph and Annie's current estate is $2.5 million, as we talked about, in retirement assets, $700,000 home, life insurance of perhaps $500,000, and assets that will continue growing throughout retirement. They're not there yet, but a couple in their early 60s with $3.7 million in combined assets today, growing at a modest rate over a 25-year retirement, can reach the $5 million threshold faster than most people expect. And when they do, Maryland will have a claim on every dollar above it at rates that begin around 8% and climb to 16% at the top. Now, there's also the inheritance tax, right? Maryland's inheritance tax is a flat 10% on assets passed to beneficiaries outside the immediate family. That's direct descendants, children, grandchildren being exempt, but if Joseph and Annie want to leave something to a sibling, a close friend, a godchild, or maybe a partner who isn't a spouse, that 10% kicks in. The combined picture, ongoing income tax, a potential estate tax exposure as assets grow, and a state that has added 2 new top income tax brackets and a capital gains surtax in just the past year, is what creates the planning opportunity. And that opportunity is where the move comes in. And what I'm about to tell you is simple. What it's worth in dollars for the right couple is anything but. So let's talk about the move. The decision that addresses all of this is relocating states at retirement. You probably saw it coming, but it's true. This can save literally tens if not hundreds of thousands of dollars depending on your situation. Now, I'm not necessarily moving across the country when I talk about this here, not abandoning everything familiar. Sometimes it's just one state that you have to move. Sometimes it's a warmer climate that was already on the list. Sometimes it's a place with family nearby. The point is that the financial dimension of where you retire, the income tax on every distribution, the estate tax on everything you've built, is a real, calculable number that deserves to be part of the retirement conversation before the moving trucks are gone. 3 state profile case studies are going to help make this concrete. So let's start with the most obvious candidate and then get to the ones that might actually surprise you. So, probably the most obvious state on this list, or any list of tax-friendly retiree states, is Florida, and it earns its reputation. It has no income tax of any kind. Florida doesn't tax 401k distributions, IRA withdrawals, pension income, investment income, or Social Security. So every dollar of Joseph and Annie's $150,000 annual spending that comes from those sources is untouched at the state level. Property taxes average around 0.86%, reasonable and offset in part by Florida's homestead exemption of up to $50,000. There's no estate tax and no inheritance tax. So for Joseph and Annie, the Florida income tax savings versus Maryland makes a ton of sense and can run approximately $6,000 to $9,000 per year on their current spending level. Over 25 years, like we talked about, that can add up to over $200,000, and that's before you account for the investment return on those dollars, which compounds the more decades you're in the market, right? On the estate side, their assets pass to their children with no state-level estate tax at any threshold. The entire estate tax layer that Maryland would eventually impose simply doesn't exist here. Now, Florida isn't for everyone. Cost of living in the desirable markets has increased significantly. Property insurance costs in certain areas have become a real planning consideration. But as a pure tax comparison, Florida represents the widest possible gap with Maryland. And for a couple whose lifestyle and preferences are compatible with the state, the financial case is difficult to argue with. So if Florida is a common, easy answer that a lot of people already know about, then the next state on this list might be more relevant to more people watching this video, because the move is as short as crossing a bridge. So let's talk about moving just one state away, right? And in this case, we're going to talk about couples who want to stay in familiar geography, close to family, close to healthcare relationships, close to the mid-Atlantic in this case that they know. Pennsylvania is a profile worth examining closely and carefully because the tax picture is more favorable than most Maryland residents even realize, and the move can be as simple as crossing one state line. Pennsylvania exempts all retirement income from state income tax, all of it, 401k, IRA withdrawals, pension income, Social Security. The state income tax rate on other income is a flat 3.07%, one of the lowest flat rates in the country. And for Joseph and Annie, drawing their retirement income primarily from pre-tax accounts, Pennsylvania's treatment of that income means a state income tax bill that is effectively zero on the bulk of their distributions. Now, against Maryland's 8.95% combined rate on income above that pension exclusion, it's a meaningful annual difference. Over a quarter century, the cumulative income tax savings for a couple in Joseph and Annie's position, moving from Maryland to Pennsylvania, drawing comparable retirement income, can reasonably run to $150,000 or more, depending on county, income level, and income composition. But there's a note worth knowing about. Pennsylvania has a wrinkle on the estate side that you need to understand. It doesn't have an estate tax, but it does have an inheritance tax, a 4.5% tax on assets passed to children and grandchildren paid for by the heirs rather than the estate. So for an estate of $3 million passed to 2 children, that's a potential inheritance tax bill of around $135,000 split between them. Maryland, by contrast, exempts direct descendants from its inheritance tax entirely. So the income tax picture clearly does favor Pennsylvania, but the estate picture is more nuanced, and the right answer depends on the size of the estate, the number of heirs, and how the assets are structured. Now, this is precisely why running the full calculation, not just the income tax comparison, but the combined lifetime tax picture, including what happens when you no longer need those dollars at the end, is what separates a real decision from a guess. And working with a comprehensive financial planner can get you there. So if you've thought about this before, or maybe never thought about this before, go ahead and click the link in the description. I'd love to talk to you. So 2 states down, we've got one more to go, and it's one that almost never appears on lists like this. And the numbers make a compelling case for why it should. So let's talk about our surprise entry. The third and final state on our list is North Dakota. Why North Dakota? Well, it never appears on lists like this, but it has a graduated income tax with rates ranging from 0 to 2.5%, among the lowest in any state that has any income tax at all. Social Security is completely exempt from state tax. IRA, 401k distributions are taxable, but at rates so modest the annual impact is a fraction of what Maryland imposes. There is no estate tax, there is no inheritance tax. The effective property tax rate is approximately 0.94%, reasonable, and with a homestead credit available to residents 65 and older. The cost of living is among the lowest in the country, and the land, well, land prices, if you want to have acreage in retirement, can be quite reasonable indeed. For Joseph and Annie, the income tax on their $150K in retirement income would likely land somewhere in the range of $1,500 to $2,500 per year, compared to $6,000 to $9,000 in Maryland. The estate passes to their children, free of any state-level estate or inheritance tax. And a cost of living considerably below the Mid-Atlantic means that their $150,000 spending target potentially goes further than it did in Maryland. North Dakota is not going to appeal to everyone. I am under no illusions with that. The climate is a genuine consideration. It gets cold. And the geography represents a real departure from the Mid-Atlantic corridor that Joseph and Annie have spent most of their lives in. But it illustrates something important about the analysis. When you let the numbers drive the geography rather than the other way around, places appear on the list that conventional retirement wisdom never considers. And the numbers for North Dakota are, for the right couple, truly compelling. So, we've talked about 3 state profiles. Let's put them all together against Joseph and Annie's actual numbers, because this is where the headline figure in the title of this video gets its foundation. So, let's talk about what those numbers actually mean for Joseph and Annie in their retirement. In income tax alone, the difference between remaining in Maryland and relocating to Florida over a 25-year retirement runs, like we said, approximately $150,000 to $225,000 in avoided state and local income tax before any investment return on those savings. Pennsylvania, a happy medium if you will, produces a similar income tax result at a somewhat lower cost of living differential. North Dakota produces roughly 70 to 80% of Florida's income tax savings with no estate or inheritance tax exposure and a lower cost of living baseline. On the estate side, the picture depends on how Joseph and Annie's assets grow. At their current trajectory, $3.7 million in combined assets at retirement, growing modestly over 25 years, the estate could reasonably approach or exceed that $5 million Maryland threshold. Every dollar above that threshold faces a Maryland estate tax beginning at 8% and doubling that at the top. In Florida or North Dakota or Pennsylvania, that tax doesn't exist. For an estate that crosses the Maryland threshold by $500,000, the state estate tax alone could run to $40,000 to $80,000 or more, paid before a single dollar reaches their children. Combined income tax savings over the retirement, avoided estate tax exposure, and the investment return on dollars that would otherwise have gone to the state, the total financial differential between retiring in Maryland and retiring in a more favorable state runs well into the hundreds of thousands for a couple of Joseph and Annie's position. For some couples, it exceeds $1 million over a full retirement. So the headline number in this video's title is not hypothetical. It is conservative math on a real, available legal decision that most retirees never take the time to formally analyze. So the point of this video isn't that Maryland is a bad place to live. I live there, and I think it's great. The point is that where you retire is a tax decision, and like every other significant financial decision in retirement, it deserves to be made in context with every other piece of information rather than by default. Joseph and Annie are running the numbers, and they haven't decided yet. There are lifestyle considerations, family proximity, healthcare relationships, and personal preferences that are all legitimate parts of the equation. But they're making the decision with their eyes open, knowing what each option actually costs in dollars over the retirement that they've worked 30 plus years to reach. And that's what the planning process is for. So if this video raised questions about your situation, about what your state is actually costing you in retirement, and whether the full calculation has ever been run, well, that's exactly the kind of conversation that I would welcome. Again, there's a link in the description to book a consult directly, and this is the kind of analysis that's worth doing before the retirement address is set, and not after. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content. In the meantime, I'll see you out there.